Welcome to Land Eco Lightning Talks and Thinking Like a Landscape with Dr. Kevin McGarrigle. In this 8-part series on the natural range of variability concept in current departure, I discuss the origins of the concept, definitions and alternatives, applications, and important considerations in the implementation of the concept. In this talk, part 7 of the series, I'll talk about the variability of what. What is it that we are measuring when we conduct an NRV assessment? Okay, let's get started. I want to begin by presenting an overly simple conceptual model of the multivariate and multi-level complexities underlying pattern and process that highlights the difficulties or the challenges of determining what to measure variability in when conducting an NRV assessment. The basic idea as represented in this conceptual framework is that the geophysical environment, specifically climate variables, terrain variables, soil attributes, interact to produce an abiotic template, a physical abiotic template, upon which biotic processes, things such as dispersal, establishment, growth, competition, mortality, play out over time and interact with each other and with the abiotic template to produce vegetation patterns. And disturbance processes such as fire, wind, flood, insects, pathogens, etc., interact with each other, with the biotic processes, and with the abiotic template to further produce and modify the vegetation patterns and dynamics over time. These vegetation patterns then, in part, influence ecosystem functions or services such as biodiversity, focal species habitat, carbon sequestration, water conservation, etc., etc. And hopefully this simplistic conceptual model highlights the fact that there are many components and many levels to pattern and process, each of which could be addressed in an NRV assessment. So determining what to measure becomes actually a huge challenge. And of course, choosing what to measure variability in ultimately depends upon the pattern and process of concern, which stems from the first axiom of landscape ecology that I discussed in an earlier series on the landscape concept, and that is that ecological patterns in both space and time affect ecological processes and vice versa. And of course, the relevant patterns and processes depend on the scale of the NRV assessment, as we've talked about in a previous talk, or vice versa. And this derives from axiom number 2 of landscape ecology, which was discussed in the first series on the landscape concept, and that is that landscape pattern and process is scale dependent. And this results in myriad possible ecological attributes that can be assessed, which depends upon how the landscape gets defined. And as we've talked about in previous talks, the landscape is comprised of a pattern-process relationship. It fundamentally is defined by a pattern-process relationship. And there are many ways to conceptualize and to measure pattern and process. On the pattern side of the equation, we've talked about there being 2 fundamental components: the composition, referring to the number and types of ecological conditions and their relative abundance, and the configuration, the spatial arrangement of those ecological conditions. It's the combination of the composition and configuration of the ecological elements or components that comprise the ecological pattern that ultimately gets related to one or more ecological processes to help define, formalize the landscape definition, and essentially frame the entire landscape assessment, including the NRV assessment. If we focus on landscape composition to begin with, there are many, many possibilities here. In common forestry applications, landscape composition variables might include things like tree density, tree size, tree basal area, also tree size class diversity. Size could be based on tree diameter or tree height. They might also include variables representing the percent and diversity of cover types, or the percent coverage of several stages, or canopy cover classes, or tree size or age classes. Variables could measure things like biomass, either total or above or below ground biomass, fire fuel loads, et cetera, et cetera. There's literally an almost infinite number of potential landscape composition variables. The choice among those, of course, would be entirely dependent upon the pattern process under consideration and, of course, data availability. As an example, if we take this rather small landscape and we depict tree height ranging from 0, places that don't currently support trees, all the way up to trees as high as 160 feet in height. And we were to reclassify that into a binary representation of open versus tree canopy, just to simplify things. And we would assimilate this variation over time in an HRV framework. We would see that the mosaic of tree height and then the reclassified canopy, non-canopy mosaic changes over time, driven by changes in disturbance and vegetation response. If we summarize that canopy mosaic, the canopy non-canopy binary mosaic, and then describe the pattern as the percent in an open canopy condition, and we do that for each snapshot in time over the course of the simulation, we get a trajectory as shown in the left figure, where the y-axis represents the percent of that landscape in an open forest condition, and the x-axis represents time during the simulation. And as we can see, the landscape is highly dynamic, driven by the disturbance processes and the vegetation response to those disturbance processes. Each snapshot of the landscape is a point in that trajectory, and if we take the collection of those points, we can generate a statistical distribution as shown on the right. In the top figure, we're looking essentially at a histogram that's been smoothed. We use a procedure known as kernel density estimation to smooth that histogram. So we essentially have the relative probability of observing any particular value in percent open forest over time. And you can see that it peaks at, let's say, around 20%, and decreases on either side to 0%, and all the way up to a high of, let's say, 75%. And we could alternatively represent that continuous distribution as a box and whisker plot, as shown in the bottom figure, where the box captures the center 50% of the distribution, and the whiskers extend out and capture the bulk of the distribution. One of the questions and one of the important decisions that has to be made in implementing an NRV assessment, once the variables have been chosen, is what range to use when specifying the NRV. Do I choose the 50% range, representing the box in this figure, or do I represent the 95% range variability, going from, let's say, the 2.5 percentile up to the 97.5 percentile in that continuous distribution? Importantly, there is no one right range. There's no one correct range to choose. One must simply make a decision and make it explicit so that everyone understands the range that is being expressed when one characterizes the NRV. Switching over to landscape configuration, just like landscape composition, there are myriad possibilities here. Some examples would include the horizontal variability as measured by the coefficient of variation in tree density, or tree size, or basal area, or percent canopy cover. One might also look at patch sizes, or the contrast between patches, or the density of patches, or the variability in patches, where those patches have been based on tree clumps, or tree gaps, or tree height or diameter size classes, or etc. One might look at the distribution of patch sizes defined based on where the patches are defined based on any of the variables listed above. So based on tree size, tree height, tree canopy cover, tree basal area, quadratic mean diameter, the list goes on and on. One might also look at the continuity of fire fuels, etc. There are myriad possibilities here for measuring landscape configuration. The choice of variable or variables would be entirely dependent upon the pattern and process under consideration. As an example, we have the developmental stage mosaic for this sample landscape shown on the left, and which the vegetation has been classified into developmental or successional stages from open up to large tree. And that's been reclassified on the right, not reclassified so much as been organized into discrete or distinct patches based on some neighbor rule. For example, in this case, I believe I used the 4 neighbor rule. So cells of a particular class that are adjacent to and share a complete side with a cell of the same class get organized into the same patch. If they only touch on the diagonal, they're not part of the same patch. And what you can see here is the developmental stage mosaic has been translated into or interpreted in terms of the patches. And if we look at the changes over time, as we simulate disturbance and succession processes, we see that the developmental stage mosaic changes and the corresponding patch size mosaic change as well. So we could interpret that trajectory over time in terms of the variability in patch size. So the coefficient of variation in patch size, which is shown on the y-axis in the figure on the left, and again, time on the x-axis, and we get a trajectory over time for landscape changes in that configuration attribute, where each point represents a snapshot in time. And once again, if we take all of those snapshots in time, all of the points along that trajectory, we can summarize that in a statistical distribution on the right, where the top figure represents essentially a smooth histogram given the relative probability of observing any particular value of the patch size coefficient of variation over time under this historical simulation. Or alternatively, we could represent that same distribution as a box and whisker plot. And then lastly, we could look at landscape function or landscape service variables, so the process side of the equation. Lots of possibilities here, things such as timber production levels or carbon sequestration levels or water discharge levels or focal species suitable habitat or their population size estimates, or perhaps the total area burned by wildfires, et cetera, et cetera. There's numerous possibilities for measuring the process. Which one or ones are chosen would entirely depend upon the pattern and process under consideration. So hopefully the point is made that there are numerous possibilities for measuring pattern in terms of both composition and configuration and process. The choice of pattern variables or process variables or some combination of those entirely depends upon the pattern and process under consideration. It's important to recognize, however, that the relevance and feasibility of the variables changes with scale. So at the local scale, for example, a variable like tree density might be relevant and it might be feasible at this scale, where we can delineate individual trees. But as we move to broader or regional scales, usually the variables change. And for example, we might, instead of looking at tree density, we may look at percent of the landscape in each of several stages, or perhaps in each of several tree density classes. In general, when we're at the local scale, the attributes often derive from individual tree level data, not always, but often. And as we move to broader or more regional scales, usually the attributes derive from classified data. So the percent in each of one or more classes as defined. Another important consideration in the NRV assessment is determining whether and choosing whether the assessment includes both composition and configuration attributes, where composition again refers to how much of each unique condition there is, and the configuration refers to what is the spatial arrangement of those unique conditions, what's the spatial heterogeneity. And in my opinion, it's important for a comprehensive assessment to include both composition and configuration attributes. But ultimately, the choice would depend upon the pattern and process under consideration. Another important consideration is whether the NRV assessment includes a comprehensive suite of attributes. So does it include just a single attribute, or one or two or three attributes, or does it include a comprehensive, a larger, more complete set of attributes that captures the pattern and process under consideration more holistically? And again, there are many, many possibilities. The question is, how many attributes are being represented, are being incorporated into the NRV assessment, and is it a sufficient suite of metrics to address the pattern and process properly? So let's finish by talking about considerations of choice among the myriad possibilities for attributes for each of the major NRV reference frameworks that we have discussed in previous talks, beginning with the contemporary reference condition or CRC approach. So in this approach, it's feasible to measure multiple composition and configuration attributes with high accuracy, but of course only those that are relevant at local scales, since usually the scale is limited to relatively fine or local scales for reasons we've already talked about. But the major strength of this approach is the feasibility of measuring tree-level patterns with relatively high accuracy, because we're dealing with contemporary landscapes where we usually have a great deal of data available from remote sensing platforms. And so we can measure things relatively accurately, and we can measure many different attributes that deal with both composition and configuration. So this is one of the major strengths of the CRC approach, is the ability to have a great deal of flexibility in choosing what to measure, the ability to be able to measure both composition and configuration, and to be able to do so relatively accurately with contemporary data. The historical reference condition, or HRC approach, is limited to relatively few composition and configuration attributes, and of course only those relevant at local scales for the reasons we've already discussed. And here it's limited to fewer composition and configuration attributes compared to the CRC approach, because here we're relying upon historical data, typically a historical snapshot of the landscape of what it looked like at a single point in time in the past. And usually the data is much more sparse and much more limited in what it can tell us. So there's fewer options, if you will, for measuring different attributes of composition and configuration. But the major strength of this approach is the feasibility of measuring tree-level patterns, albeit with only moderate accuracy, for a single historical snapshot. The historical range of variability, or HRV approach, it's feasible to measure multiple composition and configuration attributes and across multiple scales, because with this approach, we essentially have a complete or a census of the vegetation or the ecological attributes at every point in space and time. So, contingent upon the breadth of variables captured in the simulation environment, we can measure, it's usually feasible to be able to measure multiple attributes of both composition, configuration, and at multiple scales. But because it is a modeling approach, there is some uncertainty in those measured attributes, because there are assumptions built into the simulation model. These are, after all, modeled patterns, not observed patterns as they are in the CRC and HRC approach. So this is one of the bigger limitations for the HRV approach. And with the aspatial historical range of variability approach, it's limited to a single measure of composition only, based on the user-defined states. Configuration measures are simply not feasible in this approach because there is no spatial domain to this assessment. It's aspatial, as given by the title. So the major take-home message for today is that NRV is complex and benefits from a multivariate approach that includes both composition and configuration. And although not stated here, the choice needs to match the pattern and process under consideration. Important questions include, does the assessment include a comprehensive suite of ecological attributes that are relevant for the pattern and process under consideration? Does the assessment include measures of both composition and configuration? In my opinion, in most cases, an assessment is incomplete if it includes only composition or only configuration. And lastly, be sure the chosen attributes are relevant for the chosen scale of assessment. Well, this is Dr. Kevin McGarrigle signing off on this episode of Land Eco Lightning Talks. I hope this talk has been helpful, and I hope you join me for my next lightning talk. In the meantime, keep on thinking like a landscape.